Alright, we're trying something new today, and that is having a script, so I know what the hell I'm talking about. So you've had DSLR for like 3 years, you've got paying clients, sometimes you even do weddings. Let's get that thing off auto and on to something a little better. We're going to talk about some basic introductory camera stuff that'll help get you in control of your camera, as opposed to letting the dog wag you. We're going to be using Etta's old T3 because we still have it, and this is probably similar to the kind of camera that anyone who is sort of getting into interchangeable lens photography is going to have. It's a crop sensor. I think this guy's 12 megapixel Canon DSLR. We'll be doing most of the stuff with the little nifty 50, the Canon EF50 1.8 STM. This is a good lens. The reason I'm using it is one, it's good. Two, it's not too expensive, so it's worth having if you don't already have it. And three, because you get a real wide aperture on it, I'll be able to demonstrate lots and lots of things with it. We'll be talking about what an aperture is momentarily. Bear with me. I'm not a college professor, but I would have a chili pepper if I was. So, there are three main... Drop the script. There are three main settings for any camera. They are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Together, these are sometimes called the exposure triangle because there aren't four of them. Shutter speed and aperture both control how much light hits the sensor, or the film if you're using a film camera. Film is a sensor. And the ISO setting is a sensitivity setting, so it controls how sensitive your setting is to the light that falls on it. So that's the one that's a little different. In an old film camera, you would put film in it, and that would be whatever ISO your film was at. In a digital camera, you can change that very easily, which is one of the cool things about digital. If you, used to be alive in the 90s or some shit like that and had a film camera, digital ISO is calibrated to behave about the same as film ISO, so ISO 200 on your digital should behave just like that Kodak Gold you remember so fondly. I like it too, don't worry. But for now, we're actually going to ignore the ISO on your digital camera and set it to auto. Two reasons. Your pictures will be well exposed, so the camera will still fix any glaring errors you have. And two, it's just one fewer thing to worry about. So we're going to do that. So that leaves us with shutter speed and aperture, which is sort of like an exposure line segment. Real catchy. So shutter speed, as the name implies, controls how fast the shutter goes, which really is how long the sensor is exposed to light. Most cameras will let you do about 30 seconds on the long end to about 1/4000th on the fast end. And then aperture, also as the name implies, controls how big the hole in the lens is. It's like the pupils of your eye. The bigger the hole, the more light gets in. If it's smaller, then less light gets in. And then shutter speed and aperture also control other aspects of your image as well. Shutter speed is perhaps more intuitive. It essentially controls motion blur. The faster your shutter speed is, the less blur you have. So if you've got somebody just sitting still for a portrait, you can get away with a pretty long shutter because people can sit still reasonably well. But if you're trying to freeze somebody, mid-stride while they're sprinting, you're going to need a much faster shutter speed so their leg's not all blurry. Aperture is a little bit more complex. It kind of does two things, both related to focus. It controls the size of your depth of field. Your depth of field is how much of your image is in focus from front to back. If you have your camera, your sensor's here, aperture's here, and then you're focusing on something, which in this case we'll pretend is my hand. So that's the plane of focus, and your depth of field is how deep that plane is. So the larger your depth of field, the deeper your focus, and that can range from just a few millimeters thick to miles and miles, depending on a lot of things. We'll get into that at some other point. Interestingly enough, your aperture can also help control how sharp your image is due to a variety of factors. On most cameras like this, your sharpest image is going to be at about f8. Don't need to worry about that too much because there are a lot of other things that are more important. So don't worry too much about that right now. When your aperture is described using something we call an f-stop, and that's written as f over a number, so like f/8. We just say f8. The larger the f-stop number, the smaller the aperture, and that is because, this is the short version, f8, the f over 8, the f stands for focal length, so your f-stop is a ratio. So on a 50mm lens, f2 means that your aperture, your physical aperture size is the same as your focal length, which is 50 divided by 2. So f2 on a 50mm lens means you have a 25mm aperture. You literally do not ever need to worry about that, but it does help explain why a larger f number is a smaller aperture. So we say f2 is big or fast, and f11 is small or slow. So that will hopefully help alleviate some confusion there. And another nifty thing for those of you who are thinking ahead about the math, despite the fact that say f4 on a 200mm lens is a lot physically larger than f4 on a 50mm lens, because the aperture is physically farther from the sensor and light falls off in accordance to something we call the inverse square law. These things cancel each other out, which is very nice. So f4 on a 200mm lens behaves the same as f4 on a 50mm lens in terms of calculating your exposure. So that's nice. It makes things a lot easier for you. You don't have to think about size, you think f4. f4 is always f4 for now. You get into more stuff. And one other term to introduce before we get on to anything practical is the stop. In this case, a stop is a unit referring to light being changed by a factor of 2. So in other words, a doubling or a halving. So if I were to say I need to increase my exposure by 1 stop, that means I need to double the amount of light that falls on my sensor. If I were to say I need to decrease it by 1 stop, I would need to halve the amount of light. So if I have a 1 second shutter speed and I need to decrease my light by 1 stop, I would halve that. Then I'd have a 1/2 second shutter speed, and that's half as much light as 1 second. Pretty easy. So then another stop lower than the 1/2 is 1/4. So that's 2 stops less light than 1 second. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a 1 stop is double or a half. A 2 stop is 4 times. 3 stops is 8 times. Due to the way math works. The same principle applies to aperture, but the aperture number scale is based on a square root of 2 thing. The numbering isn't as neat, so f2.8 is 1 stop faster than f4, which is 1 stop faster than f5.6. So the numbers are less intuitive for apertures, but the principle is the same. Keep that in mind. Don't think too hard about it, because it's actually not that complicated. If you overthink it, you'll probably confuse yourself. The other handy thing is on most modern cameras, your controls are clicked at 1/3 stop. So if you're adjusting your shutter speed, you need to go 1 stop. If fractions are too much for you, you can just do 1, 2, 3, and that's 1 stop. And that makes figuring out your apertures a lot easier because the numbers don't make any sense. If you get lost, just think 3 clicks is 1 stop. That's not every single camera, but that is pretty standard. Your mileage may vary. Right, so let's do something practical. Your camera has a whole bunch of modes on it, but the only ones we're going to worry about right now are shutter priority and aperture priority. Because we've already got ISO set to auto, shutter priority is going to give us complete control over the shutter speed and let the camera do everything else. It'll set the aperture and it'll set the ISO. That means at any given shutter speed, it'll give us a reasonable exposure, but we'll be able to determine how frozen or blurred the action is going to be. And I'm going to cut away to an example momentarily. I haven't decided exactly what that example will be, so you'll find out before I do. To test the effects of shutter speed, we're going to use my hair, my lovely assistant, and a blow dryer. So at 1 second, everything is pretty blurry, as you'd probably expect. A quarter second, my face is starting to be pretty still, but my hair is still all over the place. 30th of a second, my face is pretty crisp, and my hair is starting to look crisp in still areas. 500th, crisper hair, very crisp face, and by 1/4000th, everything is quite frozen. So that was shutter speed. So now here's this weird lady's head that Etta has. It's probably a warning of some kind. But we're going to take portraits of this little gal and demonstrate what's so great about Aperture. So we're going to switch the camera over to AV, which stands for aperture value, which is what Canon calls aperture priority. And we're going to take pictures in one-stop increments, starting from f2 all the way up to f22. And so what we're going to see as we go from wide open f2 to very, very narrow at f22 is our exposure is going to stay about the same. There's going to be a little bit of variability just because of the way the camera calculates things. More on that eventually. But we'll see that the lady stays nice and sharp, but the background and foreground get sharper and sharper as we get smaller and smaller on our aperture scale. I've also placed a ruler next to the head to assist with sort of the visualization of that. Word. So hopefully that was cool and helpful in terms of demonstrating what you can do with control over your shutter and your aperture. I find, for example, if I'm shooting birds, I like to put it over in shutter priority mode, dial in about 1/1000th of a second to get everything nice and crisp and frozen, and just let the camera deal with the fine details, because the most important thing in that circumstance is just getting everything frozen. You'll learn what other things you can do if the camera is not behaving the way you want it to, or if you're trying to do something with that nice kind of smooth bokeh-y look that is ever so popular these days. Easiest way to start is roll over to aperture priority, open that aperture wide, and get it nice and close to your subject if you can, particularly with a longer focal length. I'm going to do another video all about blurring out your background probably next. Probably use that head again because, I don't know, it's weird and I can. So yeah, see you next time. Thanks.